Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another exciting lecture with your favorite speaker, Dr. Ronald J. Brown. Our topic for today is really quite fascinating. This is one of the most famous streets in the world. This is Broadway. 4 centuries of the Empire City, probably the most famous and the oldest of all the streets of New York, going the whole way back to the Dutch de Breedeweg in 1624. Well, then it started snaking its way up the spine of Manhattan. The English took over in 1664, and that's when it became known as Broadway, which is basically a translation of the Breedeweg in Dutch. Then point three, where Broadway almost died. That's when DeWitt Clinton laid out the grid plan and said, we want everything north, south, east, and west in straight lines. We don't want these meandering streets going back and forth. But Broadway managed to survive. Then it became Holy Broadway, the street of major churches, followed by Ladies Broadway during the Civil War and after, when it was a fashionable shopping area. Then Tenderloin, another stretch of Broadway, which was known for wild bars, houses of prostitution, wild theaters. Then at 42nd Street, we get to the Great White Way, the time that Broadway became more than a street, it became a Broadway show. Upper Broadway from Columbus Circle, further north. Then Broadway goes big time, becomes more than just a street with buildings, takes on a whole different function, and then Broadway in popular culture. So we have quite a bit to do today. So let's get started on our trip up Broadway. Well, it began as de Breedeweg under the Dutch. Picture on the left, you see New Amsterdam. And if you look closely, you'll see it's surrounded by a city wall, just like way back in ancient times. At the very bottom, near the ship, bottom left-hand corner, you see Fort Nicholas, which was Fort Amsterdam, the main fort. In front of that, the big street, you see this sort of oblong little park. That is the oldest park in New York City. That is Bowling Green. And then Broadway heads up, going north until it hits the Wall, which is today Wall Street. But then it continues as one of the main drags north and south of Manhattan. Well, that's what New Amsterdam looked like. Well, the map on the right shows us what it is today. You see Wall Street right in the middle of the picture on the right-hand side, and everything below that was the Dutch city. But of course, if you look closely, you'll see Water Street. You wonder why it's called Water Street, because it's not near the water, because Manhattan has been gradually expanded from West Street on the west side to Water Street, landfill. But you see Broadway going north from the fort at the bottom, going straight up past City Hall and going up further north. It was called the Herenstraat as well, which simply means high street, a street high in elevation. Well, it was an old Indian trail long before it became a Dutch street. On the right, you see the red line going the whole length of Manhattan. That was the old Indian trail going up Manhattan. It was a high point. The Indians would come across from the north, follow the trail down, hunting animals, picking fruits and vegetables, whatever they could find, going fishing in the river, collecting shellfish. And so it was the natural north-south street. At the very bottom was Bowling Green. There you see Bowling Green covered with trees, It's surrounded by a fence because it was one of the few grassy areas in the city. And the fence was put up to keep the pigs out because the pigs were the garbage disposal system of colonial New York. Pigs eat anything. And so people just threw their garbage on the street. They gave a whistle, the pigs came running, and there was their dinner. Now, the Indian Trail, which ended here at Bowling Green, was called, and that I can't pronounce very correctly, it was called the Wickwasket Trail. And that was the main Indian trail. And the Indians would follow it north and south the whole way down. Of course, there was no Bowling Green, but it was the bottom of Manhattan. Here again, we see a picture of the Dutch city. You see the windmill. You have to have a windmill. You see Fort Amsterdam. In front of that, you already see little Bowling Green surrounded by a fence. Then you see Broadway going to the right, going through the wall. It wasn't much of a wall then. It was just a bunch of wooden palisades, but it had a gate to keep out the Indians and the wild animals. So that was the beginning of Broadway. Well, in 1664, the English marched in. And there you see Peter Stuyvesant with his peg leg arguing whether he should surrender his city or whether he should resist the English. Well, he wanted to resist, fight to keep his colony. Whereas everybody in his family, most of the other people in the colony said, we don't care what flag is flying over our colony. We just want to live here, keep our homes, our businesses, keep our families, and what happens will happen. Don't forget, under the Dutch, New Amsterdam was a very mixed city. It had the first Sephardic Jews. It had German Lutherans. It had English Quakers. It had the Pennsylvania Dutch, the Amish who had already come, Baptists, Methodists, you name it, they were there, as well as a large population of African slaves and a good number of Native Americans. So the majority of the people said, well, whatever flag hangs over us, we don't really care too much. We just don't want the city to be bombarded by the English ships and destroyed. So in 1664, Peter Stuyvesant surrendered the city to the English. Well, when the English took over, they had promised to the Dutch that they could stay. They could keep all of their lands and everything. The area below Wall Street was the old Dutch town, and the English simply built a new city outside the city wall, and that became the English town. It was sort of like a layer cake. And the wall was the cream in between the bottom layer of the cake, which is Dutch, and the second layer, which was English. Well, to show that it was an English city, at the corner of Wall Street, the English tore down the wall, so it became a street. The English built at that corner a church, and that was Trinity Church. It was the English church, the Episcopal Church, in 1698, to show that, well, the colony is diverse, but it is an English colony. And so the English church is going to be on a prominent location. So the English started building their town. Church they built houses north of the church, all along Broadway, which remained the main drag. Near the corner of Wall Street and Broadway, they built a new city hall in the year 1700, which you see on the left. Had a little alcove, a little balcony area inside. Well, when George Washington was president of the United States, they built that balcony and they put the pillars that you see on the right with the American flag. And it was on that balcony that George Washington took the oath of office. And just down the street, you see the first Trinity Church. So Wall Street ended up becoming a very nice residential area with city hall, wealthy people. Gradually, banks and insurance companies started moving in. At the very end of Wall Street was the slave market, where shiploads of slaves were brought from Africa and auctioned off at the slave market at the end of Wall Street down near the East River. Well, the English city started growing. Along Broadway, there were nice homes. There were businesses, churches were gradually built, taverns, hotels, and it was a very nice, and it remained a very broad street, meaning it was the widest street in the city, gradually pushing forever northward along Manhattan. Gradually, the area of Lower Broadway, the old Dutch town, the old fort, was torn down, and the building we see in the upper right, the Custom House, was built in 1907. That's where the ship captains went to pay the import duties on their shiploads of merchandise. That's why in that building today, you see the picture in the middle, old ships. You see paintings of later ships. And in front of the building, there are 4 big statues. These are the 4 continents. Back then, the 4 continents were Africa, America, Asia, and Europe. They didn't have all the 7 or 8 continents we have today. Shipping companies dominated Lower Manhattan, and the buildings are still there. On the left, you see the Cunard Building, which is at the very bottom. See Bowling Green right at its foot. These are Broadway numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. So the old Dutch buildings and later English buildings were torn down, and these new buildings gradually, over the centuries, grew taller and taller and more impressive. Well, gradually, Broadway was marching up Manhattan. In the map, if you look at the left-hand side, you see the dark black areas. That was basically New York City in around 1807. But you can see going right through the middle of that black area, that is Broadway. Well, DeWitt Clinton, who was mayor and then governor, decided that the rest of Manhattan should be covered with city blocks. So he laid out avenues, numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, going north and south. On the picture, that's right and left. And the streets, which he also numbered 1 up to 200 or whatever. And according to this plan, Broadway would gradually disappear. You see the parade ground, that's Washington Square, where NYU is at. And that was the area where the National Guard of New York State practiced their marching and shooting. So that was allowed to stay. But the rest was going to be streets and avenues. And eventually, as you see in the middle of the map, there is no more Broadway. So Broadway almost disappeared from the map, according to DeWitt Clinton's grid plan. Here we see a close-up of that map. You see Broadway going up and down. It was eventually renamed Bloomingdale, but it then fizzled out at 23rd Street, and the parade ground would gradually replace Broadway and Bloomingdale. And north of the parade ground, you don't see any more Broadway. So it could have very, very easily died out. But New Yorkers liked their Broadway. And they started saying this is the heart of New York. It was the heart of New Amsterdam, we should keep this street. So gradually, it was decided that Broadway would continue through the parade ground, and it would then remain on the map and continue north. Well, DeWitt Clinton, who laid out the grid plan, also built what is today New York City Hall. This was constructed in 1811. On the right, you see the picture, big, beautiful building. On the left is Broadway. In front of it is what we call City Hall Park. City Hall Park was a very public entertainment area. On the weekends, that's where criminals were hung. And families would show up early in the morning, put down a blanket. They'd bring the kids and the grandparents and a picnic lunch, and they would watch the criminals being hung. That was the big screen TV of the day. Well, City Hall was the largest city hall ever built in America at the time, and the most expensive. Look at that entrance hallway there, the big stairs going up. Once again, everybody said to DeWitt Clinton, first, you're laying out this grid plan, and not just laying it out, but surveying it, laying out the streets. And then you build this monumental city hall, which is too big for the town. And Peter Stuyvesant, not Peter Stuyvesant, but DeWitt Clinton said, mark my word, one day New York City will have a population of 1 million. Well, today the population of the city, all 5 boroughs, is about 8.5 million, 20-some million in the entire New York urban area. So the continuation of Broadway, City Hall, was a sign of the city's future greatness. Well, beyond City Hall, as you get up further north, you see the first of the churches. Well, we already saw Trinity Church, which was at the corner of Wall Street and Broadway. First church burnt down in the Great Fire of 1776. The second church was hastily built in the early 1800s and almost collapsed, and so it was torn down. And the third one is the church you see today with its big spire. A little bit further north, St. Paul's Chapel was built right across, kitty-cornered across from City Hall on Broadway. And you see the big spire and the Greek entrance. Today, when you go down there, you see skyscrapers all over, just like you see in the picture on the left with Trinity Church. But when these churches were built, they were small buildings like you see on both sides here with trees and an open area. Another church in 1839 was the Church of the Messiah. This was a Unitarian church, which was built further up Broadway. That one's not there. Third Trinity Church is there. St. Paul's Chapel, the oldest church in Manhattan, is also still there. Now, this is St. Paul's Chapel. This is where George Washington went to pray after he took the oath of office as president in 1789. St. Paul's Chapel was built in 1764, and it did not burn in the Great Fire of 1776. So it is still there, and it is still going strong. On the right again, you see a rather blurry painting of it, again showing the small buildings which dominated lower Manhattan, but it also emphasized how broad Broadway was. A horse and buggy, one horse and buggy, was almost lost in this broad avenue cutting through Manhattan. Well, Broadway continues further north until it gets to 10th Street. And there, James Renwick, one of the greatest architects of New York City, built Grace Church. Well, Grace Church is very, very famous. It was in the new wealthy area of the city. There was a big house there, the Brevoort House, an old Dutch family that had settled around 10th Street. And the house, when it was built, was literally out in the country. And so it was surrounded by trees and gardens, and it was a very beautiful house. Well, gradually, as the city started expanding, Broadway started pushing further north. Well, Mr. Brevoort, one of the richest men in the city at the time, had a peach tree in his garden. And he said, you can take everything else for this new road, which is pushing north, but do not touch my peach tree. And so Broadway, which had been going on a straight line in front of Grace Church, gradually turned slightly to the left and began to go across Manhattan in a diagonal way. Well, at 10th Street is the famous Grace Church. It was the church of the city's elite. It is an Episcopal church where all of the rich families went for weddings and funerals and Sunday services. Well, in 1863, it was in in the church where, Grace Church, where Tom and Lavinia Thumb, the little midgets, were married, right in the middle of the Civil War. Well, this was the great marriage of the century. You can see the picture on the right, the priests going around, the church filled with all the wealthy of New York City, and Tom and Lavinia Thumb were married. Well, remember, this is in the middle of the Civil War. So Abraham Lincoln sent a special train to New York, loaded the couple on the train, wined and dined them in the White House, put them on a battleship, and it sailed around the world. The King of Thailand even gave them a wedding present, an elephant. They visited the King of England, of France, of Germany, of Italy, of Spain, of Japan, visiting the Mauritius in India in this year-long honeymoon. So once again, Broadway was a major site for public events, such as the glorious nuptials of Tom Thumb and Lavinia. Well, by the time we get to 10th Street, Broadway turns slightly to the left and goes up at an angle, cutting through the grid plan. And that became known as Ladies' Mile. After the Civil War, many New Yorkers were fabulously wealthy, and they wanted to spend their money. In 1862, the Iron Palace was opened. I see it on the right. It was made out of iron pillars. It was the very first department store. Because before that, a woman, such as the ones you see on the left, they'd have to go to one store for their hats. They had a shoe store. They had a dress store. They had an undergarment store. They had a stocking store. They had a corset store, a makeup store, a hairdressing salon. Everyone was a separate building. Well, A.T. Stewart, an immigrant from Northern Ireland, brought all of these businesses together and put them under one roof. And that became known as the very first department store. Arnold, Constable and Company at 19th Street, a block-long store. This was another department store. The roof was considered the most elegant ever built in New York because it had the sloped roof with all the decorations. This is called a mansard roof, named after the inventor of this type of roof called Monsieur Mansart in France. But this was considered the height of elegance at 19th Street and Broadway. Lord and Taylor, one block up at 20th, another mansard roof with a tower, opened in 1870. Look at those big plate glass windows. By 1870, you started having electricity, and so people would go window shopping at night along Broadway. The Flatiron Building at 23rd Street. Picture on the left, 23rd, where Fifth Avenue and Broadway intersect, and they make an X on the map. This opened in 1902. Well, the age of electricity had arrived along Broadway. Look at all those electric lines all over the place, going from store to store, apartment to apartment. So modern, but yet everything in the street is horses and buggies. But again, you get the impression of how broad the street was. Once again, measures like the Champs-Élysées in Paris or the Paseo de la Reforma in Mexico City, one of the grand avenues of the world. Macy's department store at Broadway and 34th Street. Picture on the left. Once again, you still see horses and buggies in 1901. Well, in 1924, it was Mr. Macy who organized the very first Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade. On the right, you see the chariot with Santa Claus. Well, of course, when Mr. Macy organized a Thanksgiving Day parade, he couldn't care less about Thanksgiving. But he knew that the Christmas shopping season was arriving. So, from the Upper West Side, the parade went south along Broadway, not Fifth Avenue, but Broadway. And of course, it ended at Macy's department store. The store was open. Everybody would go in, and you had your first shop until you drop experience. Well, beginning at 24th Street, Broadway changes again. Historically, from 24th up to 42nd Street, this was called the Tenderloin District. Now, a tenderloin is a very expensive cut of meat in the butcher shop. The name came from, and this is the legend, a police captain, Alexander S. Clubber Williams. Because when a cop was stationed on Broadway in this district, it was filled with nightclubs, saloons, bordellos, gambling casinos, clip joints. And of course, the police were robbing people, shaking them down. They'd arrest the prostitutes, but if you paid them a certain amount of money, you could go right back to work. So if you were a cop and you were stationed on Broadway between 24th and 42nd, you ended up eating well. Your wife was well dressed. You had a nice house and horse and maybe even a carriage. So the district became known as the Tenderloin District. Well, the name stuck. We even had us March, which was the czar of the Tenderloin, a cop who made a fortune shaking people down. Beneath the badge, the story of police corruption. Richard Zach's brand new book, Island of Vice, where Theodore Roosevelt, as police commissioner, came in the late 1800s and said, I'm going to clean up this mess. He tried to reform the police, make New York into a nice, clean city, get rid of corrupt cops. Well, unfortunately, gambling, prostitution, and police corruption are part of New York life. And even Theodore Roosevelt gave up because he couldn't clean up New York. So he had to content himself with becoming president of the United States. Postcards were sent out the heart of the Tenderloin, 33rd Street and Broadway, filled with clubs, filled with bars, and became a must-visit place when a tourist came to New York. To walk up and down the Tenderloin was a thrill for tourists from abroad and for tourists from the interior of the United States. One of the most famous music halls was Coster and Biles. Dancing girls, wild music, great fun, alcohol, you name it. It was really one of the most popular music halls along the Tenderloin. Fulton Theater opened in 1911. Again, Theodore Roosevelt was desperate to clean the place up. He wanted this to be a respectable place. Today it's the Helen Hayes Theater. Well, what was going on there? Musical shows, Orange Blossoms. One of the most famous dancers was a French woman, Mademoiselle Pilar Morin, who was famous for bringing the latest in French decadence to the Tenderloin. The Weber and Fields Broadway Music Hall on the left, whoop-de-doo, who knows what kind of show that was. August L. Jensen's Hofbräuhaus, a German-style drinking establishment with their bands and all kinds of good German food. Don't forget, in the 1880s, 90s, New York City was the third largest German-speaking city in the world. Only Berlin and Vienna had more German speakers than New York City. The Haymarket was another wild theater, and in fact, you could have almost anything in the place. It was called Sin's Shopping Mall, where you name it, you wanted it, you could get it at the Haymarket. The famous Tenderloin street parties, where the people would take over the street. They would dance, they would have fun. And the French influence for decadence was very powerful. The 1890s houses on West 39th Street, just off of Broadway, were known all over the country because in New York, if you went to the houses of prostitution, New York girls performed activities that were illegal all around the rest of the country. Unnatural practices, they were called. And a really wild house of prostitution was called a French circus because girls from France would do things that American girls would not. So if you want more information, Google French circus, New York City, and I'll go into a bit more detail. The Bohemia Casino Theater, which still stands, the Queen of Bohemia, which was a great dance and music show. Tenderloin was a new musical comedy. And as you can see from the pictures, it was as wild as they could get away with back in the early 1900s. Well, there was one very respectable institution on the Tenderloin, and this was the Old Metropolitan Opera. This was built by the new wealthy of New York, not the old aristocrats. They had their own opera house. But the Old Metropolitan Opera House was larger, had more seats, and could accommodate the growing class of new wealthy. Well, By 42nd Street, we are up to another section. 42nd Street, which marks the end of the Tenderloin, had its own character. It had a lot of movie theaters, but by the 1950s and 60s, a lot of these old movie theaters, these movie palaces, were being turned into X-rated movie theaters. Books like Tales of Times Square, Sex, Drugs, Crime, Corruption, Just Another Day in Times Square. X-rated movies open 24 hours. A book by James Traub, The Devil's Playground, showing the decadence that went on in Times Square. Well, Times Square doesn't exist anymore. Ayatollah Giuliani, when he was mayor, he cleaned it up and handed it over to Disneyland. And now it's all just overpriced, tacky entertainment. But from 42nd Street, we have the beginning of what we call the legitimate theater. Here again, Broadway is still going kitty-cornered through Manhattan. And as you can see in the picture on the right, Broadway is that street on the left, which cuts across the grid plan. In 1904, the Times newspaper building opened. So when you see in both of the pictures. And in 1907, to celebrate the new building, it was decided to have a festive New Year's ball drop from the top of the building. And that began a tradition where hundreds of thousands of people gather in Times Square to witness the annual ball drop. I travel a lot, and very often I'll be traveling on holidays because airline prices are very often very cheap. If you want to travel on Christmas Day or New Year's Eve, the planes are pretty well empty, but they keep them flying. So I've celebrated New Year's in probably 20 or 30 different countries of the world. And no matter where I'm at, I go out to a bar. And if they're celebrating New Year's, you always know that when it's midnight in New York, all the big screen TVs are going to switch to the ball drop in Times Square. It is an international, global festival. I'm sure the aliens out on Mars tune into the Times Square ball drop to celebrate New Year's. Well, beginning here, we have what is called the Great White Way. Great White Way because by 1904, all of the buildings had electricity, and they were literally covered with light bulbs. One of the first big theaters was the Hammerstein's Olympia, which was one of the most magnificent theaters and movie palaces on the Great White Way, which stretches from 42nd to 53rd Street. Some of these are still there. Some have been torn down. Many of them are being restored. And here we see why it was called the Great White Way. All the buildings were outlined with electric lights. They would leave the windows lit that were facing the street. And so you had this celebration of electricity with all of its glory on the Great White Way. There was even a Broadway show called The Great White Way. The very first musical, or what we could call a Broadway show, claims to be The Black Crook in 1866. And this type of entertainment, this musical, gave its name to this popular form of entertainment. It wasn't a big highbrow opera in German or Italian. It was in English. It was popular songs that you could hum to and you could sing in the shower. The girls were dancing. The guys were good looking in beautiful costumes. The scenery, of course, it was all made out of paper mache and wood, but it was elegant. Another theater along the way was Niblo's Theater, an old theater going back a long time, of course, which doesn't exist anymore. The Phantom of the Opera is claimed to be the longest running musical. It finally will close February 18th in 2023. And as the time I speak, they've had almost 14,000 performances. So to come to New York at any time, you had to get your Broadway show tickets. Broadway was unique because it celebrated the cultural diversity of New York City. Whether it was a trip to Chinatown, the Book of Mormon, the Fiddler on the Roof, Annie Get Your Gun by Irving Berlin, or I'm Just Wild About Harry Shuffle Along. Jews, Chinese, even Mormons, African Americans, white Americans could all be part of this Broadway popular entertainment style of music. Now, Broadway shows, as we all know, there's off-Broadway, which means a theater has a capacity of between 100 and 499. Off-Broadway is a theater that has a seating capacity of less than 100. A Broadway show has a seating capacity of 500 and more. Now, on this map, you get a good vision, a good view of Broadway as it cuts across the grid plan, basically telling the north-south avenues and the east-west streets to go get lost. Broadway is still alive and well, defying the grid plan. And you see this huge cluster of theaters. See Times Square, where Broadway and the Avenue cross, and then up at Duffy Square, where you have another triangular area. So this is the famous Broadway Theater District. There are monuments along that stretch. George M. Cohan, 1878, 1942, famous for his songs Yankee Doodle Dandy, standing there with the Times building behind him. Well, all of these actors, restaurant workers, designers, hairdressers, all of these tens of thousands of people who keep the Broadway shows running have their own little world. On the left, you see St. Malachi's Catholic Actors Chapel. On the right, you see the Actors Temple. Well, these were largely immigrants and children of immigrants from Eastern Europe or from Southern Italy who made their career on Broadway, dancing, singing, painting, designing, and performing music. One of the big events of this stretch of Broadway was the funeral of Rudy Valentino, considered the sexiest heartthrob of his age. Well, it was in New York where he had an illness and he died in 1926. Well, his New York funeral was held at St. Malachi's Catholic Church, which was the event of the season. Well, after the funeral, his body was put on a train and it went back to Hollywood, where he actually lived. And it is said that so many women, so many young girls threw themselves in front of the train because they could not imagine life without their beloved Rudy. Look at that woman on the left. She worships him. Well, that was the type of woman who would throw herself in front of the train because life was impossible without Rudy. Many of the old theaters have been restored as theaters, but one, the old Mark Hellinger Theater, was turned into a church, and this is the Times Square Church. So if you want to see an absolutely magnificent theater completely restored, go into the Times Square Church with David Wilkerson, and you will see a meticulously decorated church, which was one of the old Broadway theaters. Every theater had its own unique style. The Lamb theaters were the most famous for exotic entertainment because people wanted to be entertained. They wanted to be transported to a place where they had never been and probably would never go. Later on, the music halls and the movie palaces took over a lot of these theaters and became famous for first run movies. Well, the Great White Way ends. Again, on the left, you see that it goes up. Broadway goes straight up to 42nd Street, then it cuts across again until it gets up to 59th Street, which is Columbus Circle, and it continues to zigzag back and forth between the lower Manhattan and the upper Manhattan. Well, Columbus Circle, right at the corner of 59th Street and Central Park, is a monumental area. It has the statue of Christopher Columbus, which is controversial, but still, it's still there, with a traffic circle, something that's very rare in New York. England has traffic circles, but the United States never liked traffic circles, but there's one there. And you see the skyscrapers, which are going up one after the other in this area. In the picture in the middle on the left, you see one of the entrances to Central Park, and straight ahead is Central Park South, one of the most luxurious residential addresses. The Trump International Hotel and Tower is at Columbus Circle with its giant aluminum globe in front of it. On the right, you see the Time Warner Towers soaring above a little statue of Christopher Columbus. A wonderful area to stroll around, big shopping arcades in the Time Warner Towers, restaurants. And if you want to, you can stop into Trump International Hotel and Tower and visit the lobby. Well, a little bit further along Broadway, by the time you get up into the 62nd up to 66th Street, you come across another monumental establishment on Broadway, and this is Lincoln Center, built between 1955 and 1969. One of the great accomplishments of Robert Moses, the great urban planner, bringing together Philharmonic Orchestra, the opera, libraries, the Juilliard School of Music, the Ballet of New York City, all kinds of other cultural institutions built around a big open plaza, which you see in the right. In the middle, on the right is the opera, on the left is the Philharmonic Orchestra, and on the left is the New York City Ballet. I don't know if the ballet is still there, but underneath all of that is a giant underground parking spot. Here again, in the picture on the left, you see that Broadway is going kitty-cornered up. ignoring Columbus Avenue, ignoring the streets, charting its own way through Manhattan, totally ignoring the grid plan. By the time we get up into the hundreds, if you look at the map on the right, you can see by about 108th and 10th Street, Broadway decides to get its act together and to go straight for a short while. And that's where it cuts through the campus of Columbia University, Barnard College, and a whole cluster of educational institutions. Here we see the entrance to the Columbia University with the two statues at the entrance, one to sciences and the other to the arts. And that, where the people are standing out in the bottom, that is Broadway itself. Also in this cluster of educational establishments is Jewish Theological Seminary, Union Theological Seminary, and a whole cluster of libraries, research centers, all clustered on both sides of Broadway. Of course, along with that are residences for students, libraries, restaurants, faculty residences, hotels, all kinds of university-related institutions. Eventually, we get to the far north of Broadway and far north of Manhattan. And there you see one of the last big establishments along Broadway, and this is the cloisters. This is a collection of monasteries brought over stone by stone from Europe, reassembled into a complex which transports you back to the Middle Ages. Well, Broadway eventually ends, and it leaps across the Harlem River by a rather ugly looking bridge called the Broadway Bridge. This bridge rises, and so it opens up so big ships can actually sail through and under the bridge. Well, Broadway continues up through the Bronx, and some people say it even goes up to Albany and up to the North Pole, but we're not going to go there today. But Broadway, from the colonial times, became a major center for big public displays. In 1783, when the English finally withdrew from New York City, George Washington marched down from the Bronx, the whole length of Broadway, down into the English city, and into the Dutch city, and down to Bowling Green, where one of his soldiers climbed up the flagpole, tore down the British flag, and put up an American flag. The story is the English wanted to make that as difficult as possible, so they went out and they greased the pole with pig's grease so that it would be almost impossible to climb up it. But evidently, someone was able. On the right, you see a drawing of the famous New York City 7th Regiment marching down Broadway in 1863, one of the big public displays during the Civil War. Having a parade up and down Broadway meant that the occasion was very important. In fact, the area from Bowling Green up to City Hall is called the Canyon of Heroes. It is said that the very first ticker tape parade, now a ticker tape is this long, narrow strip of paper that you see in the picture on the right, which was used for a teletype instrument for communicating the stock market values, whether they go up or down. And little holes were punched in the paper, and you had to be able to read it. Well, once the message was read, these long strips of paper were just thrown in a pile. And so when there was a big occasion, such as the dedication of the Statue of Liberty on October 28, 1886, the city fathers and dignitaries and French dignitaries marched down Broadway to celebrate the dedication of the statue. It was supposed to be dedicated in 1876 to celebrate 100 years of American independence, but unfortunately, difficulties building the pedestal for the statue, and the statue was donated by the French people, and the Americans had to build the pedestal. So it took them another 10 years to get everything in order, but it was celebrated with a giant parade down the Canyon of Heroes. Major events, battles, wars, political campaigns always involved a dramatic parade down Broadway. On the right, the famous picture of a celebration at Times Square ending World War II, where the sailor goes up and gives a big kiss to a girl that looks like she was a nurse. Of course, until today, there are like 7,000 women who claim that that was her who was getting a kiss in this famous picture. More recently, in 1991, the women's soccer victory was celebrated with a ticker tape parade down from City Hall, down the Canyon of Heroes to Battery Park. On the right, you see some of the girls celebrating the parade #1, champion of women's soccer. So this is the famous Canyon of Heroes. Now, Broadway in popular culture, it is celebrated probably more than any other street in New York. We have songs about Harlem. We have songs about the Bowery. We have songs and plays about Wall Street. But Broadway really captures first prize. George M. Cohan's 1904 song, "Give My Regards to Broadway." Tell the old gang at 42nd Street I'll soon be there. I want to see the old time crowd because I'll be there pretty soon. Lullaby of Broadway, Harry Warren and lyrics by Al Dubin, 1935. Good night, baby. Good night. The milkman's on his way, meaning you are going to bed because you've been out partying on Broadway all night. You're going to bed in the early morning when the milkman is already delivering his bottles of milk. So this is a rockabye your baby round till everything gets hazy. Party until you drop and then sleep all day. This is a Doris Day and Gene Nelson movie. Was one of the great celebrations of Broadway. A lot of people have written novels and books about Broadway. It happened on Broadway, an oral history of the Great White Way, interviewing all of those anonymous people whose names weren't in lights, but made Broadway shows and the fame of Broadway possible. Deanna Haviland, Death on the Ladies' Mile, the crimes that went on Broadway. The Devil's Playground, a century of pleasure and profit in Times Square. The Broadway musical Quiz Book. Can't go on Trivial Pursuit and play games like that if you don't at least have a good knowledge of Broadway musicals, great events along Broadway. This is part of Broadway popular culture. Well, the big event of Broadway was COVID-19, where for the first time in history, Broadway shut down. Theaters were closed, which meant restaurants were closed. Think of all of the thousands of set designers, painters, dancers, musicians who lost their jobs because of COVID-19. Now, a lot of these people were self-employed. I mean, they didn't have a big company going to bail them out or continue to pay salaries. Many of them went bankrupt. I remember going out to Fire Island and sitting in the jacuzzi one evening, and a bunch of these young people came in and got in the jacuzzi, and it ended up that they were all unemployed waiters from the big Broadway show area restaurants. They had pulled their money. They had phoned the manager of the hotel where I was staying and saying, we are 6 or 7 people. Can we have one room and get some mattresses? Because that's all we can afford. Well, needless to say, we sat in the jacuzzi drinking wine and listening to backstories of every Broadway show. Well, gradually, Broadway is coming back to life. In fact, if my information is correct, it was Springsteen on Broadway at the St. James Theater was the first show to reopen in August 17, 2021. So this was the return of Broadway. So I hope you enjoyed our little stroll along Broadway. I'm a great fan of what I call great boulevards. Picture of me last summer when I was in Paris taking pictures and making a program on the Champs-Élysées. I've done programs on Nevsky Prospect in St. Petersburg, Paseo de Reforma in Mexico City. Every great city has an avenue. The Royal Way of London, the great avenues of the world. So I'm sure when we start migrating to other planets and building new cities and civilizations, having a giant, magnificent boulevard central to the city is going to be part of the human patrimony of urban living. So this is Ronald J. Brown logging off. I hope you enjoyed today's program, and I look forward to seeing you in the future for another exciting program, whether it is on a great boulevard or whether it is on some other topic. You will always be thrilled with my guided tours. So, thank you very much. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the future.